Hello and welcome to the finals of 1999 Pro Tour Chicago. I'm Randy Bueller. I'm here with Brian Hacker, and we're really looking forward to this championship match between Bob Maher Jr. on the right hand of your screen and Brian Davis on the left.
Brian does need to get some more life back. He's lost a lot of life from the necropotence. Yeah.
Brainstorm.
Great.
So
he has corrupt and drain
brainstorm.
though, right?
The counter spell here would be big.
That's big.
That's huge.
Does he still have two blue?
That is huge.
Just gotta go beat down with two top villages though, right?
I think so.
Chaos Blessing, targeting. Chaos Blessing, Impulse, and Enlightened Tutor. Okay.
He's gonna Gaze Blessing, targeting Gaze Blessing, Impulse, and Enlightened Tutor.
Gives him a chance to reshuffle his deck with Brainstorm.
Yep. Now be drawing off a fresh deck.
Bob's got some
Go ahead.
weird synergy he has against Necropotence, where his Brainstorm will allow him to hide cards from the Unmasked.
Right. Yep. And Bob's going to do exactly that. Bob Maher brainstormed this as a response to the Nevinyr's disc, came up with Force of Will, used it to counter the disc. It's good stuff.
For 3.
It's all right, but since he's already got the 2 discs, he really doesn't need more permanent elimination.
He's giving Bob time to sort of set up shop. Bob's got a floodplain and a brainstorm. He's going to get to do some brainstorm fetch land tricks now, and he's given Bob plenty of time to set up. I mean, I'm not sure this draw was fast enough to keep. Davis would have liked to gotten a land right there.
Right, that would have been helpful because then he could corrupt.
Brainstorm. That's not good enough. He has to find Force of Will.
A forbid, he needs to Brainstorm, hoping he can find a counter spell in the land.
He's going to Brainstorm main phase, try to get a land into play. That's Force of Will.
Ooh.
Force of Will, Brainstorm, Disrupt.
That's a good
Disrupt
draw.
Could be relevant. Still, this is not a land. We know this from before.
Right.
It does have another Brainstorm in his hand, though. Does this Brainstorm? If this is a land and a counterspell, it's an Enlightened Tutor, a Force of Will, and a Brainstorm.
That is an amazing Brainstorm.
How many blue cards does he have for those Force of Wills?
Amazing Brainstorm.
He has 2 Force of Wills and 2 blue cards.
That is
all Davis has is a Consult, right?
Absolutely amazing.
And a Corrupt. Is this over?
It's getting real close to being over.
He's got 2 Force of Wills against a Corrupt and a Drain. That's it. Bob Maher wins the Pro Tour.
Oh, hello. Welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, designer of one of the featured cubes on Cube Cobra Maddox.
It's a great honor. I had to work really hard to become a member of Cube Cobra's Patreon.
Yeah, you just paid for that. You paid for that benefit.
You just pay for that.
But the regular cube is up there now. Now, what made you choose the regular cube as opposed to one of your many other cube projects to feature on Cube Cobra?
I mean, it's just my baseline. It's the core of my cube thing. Also, it takes quite a while for your featured cube to come up in Cube Cobra. So it was a while ago that I put that in the queue.
Were you delighted and surprised to see it? Did you
I
forget?
was. I got all kinds of people are drafting my cube and looking at it, and that's very exciting.
Are you getting a lot of new drafts? I was curious to see what it would amount to have your cube featured on Cube Cobra. I didn't have any idea.
Some.
I haven't actually
not
submitted.
A huge number.
I too am a patron of Cube Cobra, but I have not submitted my cube for the featured cube list because whatever. It's fine. But I'm glad that people are seeing it. You can help change the tide of the cube world, Anthony, by getting more people to understand and accept that the cube does not have to be about playing the most powerful cards.
I'm certainly doing my best.
This week's podcast, however, is not going to help in that regard, Anthony, because we are dedicating an entire episode to talking about one specific card, and that card is Brainstorm.
Wow, this is a great idea because I feel like we're kind of running out of ideas here, and all of a sudden you just hit on 20,000 new podcast episodes.
We are not running out of ideas because I wanted to record this episode as soon as I heard the episode of the 540 where Justin and Ryan agreed that Brainstorm is the single most overrated card in the Magic Online Vintage Cube. I want to record this episode right after that, but we had to stick it in the queue because we have so many other episodes lined up and things to talk about. Suffice it to say, Anthony, this is a controversial card amongst cube designers. Now, I think in the constructed Magic world, people have pretty much agreed that Brainstorm is broken, right?
I mean, broken is a loaded term that means it has a complicated history, but I would definitely say it is an iconic, powerful card that is format defining.
Before we dive into more about this card and its different perceptions, do you want to just hit us with the rules text of Brainstorm, Anthony? I notice you have about 7 or 8 Brainstorms in your hand right there.
Oh, I've got almost a cool 20 over here. Yeah, just grab some reference material before starting the podcast.
Some reference Brainstorms.
All right, so Brainstorm is blue mana for an instant. Draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library.
I
don't know why I read it. I don't know why I read the card.
I wish we had the video feed of you actually looking down to read it as if you didn't know what the card did.
I just want to get the words right.
That is what Brainstorm does.
Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I think this can be a nice, short, tidy episode.
It is really clean, which is one of the things I like about Brainstorm. There's a lot of things I like about Brainstorm, though. First, I want to talk about why I think this is a controversial card, because there are 2 sides to this Brainstorm argument, and one side, and specifically I mean controversial in the cube world. And now this episode is not going to be just about cube, so if you're tuning in because you care about people talking about Brainstorm but don't care about cube, this episode is still for you. But in the context of cube, it is a controversial card because I think most people's opinions on Brainstorm kind of fall into 2 camps. One camp is, hey, Brainstorm is banned in Historic, restricted in Vintage, too good to be printed into Modern. It's a defining card of Legacy. This card is clearly a very powerful card. It's great in Cube. I'm going to pick it highly. I'm going to play it often. And we're going to refer to Cube more broadly in this episode. Brainstorm is actually a card that is in my Bun Magic Cube, which is a powerful, vintagey Legacy environment, your regular Cube, which is a lower power environment, and the Magic the Gathering Online Vintage Cube, which is a different kind of cube environment entirely, but it's got power, it's got everything. This card shows up in a lot of different environments. So anyway, one of the arguments is that this card is very good in Constructed, it's therefore very good in Cube. It's just a very powerful card. It belongs in all of these environments. It's a high pick, it's very powerful. And then the other perspective is largely that Brainstorm, absent a bunch of fetch lands in your deck, is not much better than a Reach Through the Mists. Reach Through Mists is a card that is just instant, arcane, blue mana, draw card. It's the closest we have in Magic to 1 mana draw card. I mean, all of the generic cycling cards are 1 mana draw card, but all the other cards do a little bit more. That one just has the arcane subtype, which is rarely relevant. So we'll use Reach Through Mists as a sort of baseline for just the draw card mode. That's specifically when you can't do something else with the other cards you put back on top of your library with Brainstorm. Now, I have a lot of notes prepared for this episode, Anthony. I'm feeling very energized, very excited about this topic. I want to make sure this is not just me ranting at you, though. So do you maybe want to explain to people that maybe are not familiar? I don't take for granted that anybody listening knows or understands why Brainstorm is good. Do you want to just kind of talk through the basic play patterns of Brainstorm with the shuffle effect and why that's so powerful?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm the wrong person to talk about that because I'm not a person that plays these formats. But I mean, basically, the effect is pretty simple. You're drawing 3 cards, putting 2 back, so you're net neutral, like you said, right? So you're ending up with
so 1 for 1.
1 for 1. You had 7 cards in your hand. You're going to end up with 7 cards in your hand at the end. It also just gives you some selection. It's not like a scry where you can actually get rid of some of those cards. If the game ends up going 4 turns longer and you're not playing any of the draw spells, you're still going to draw all those cards anyway. So at a baseline in like a sort of imagined vanilla format, it kind of doesn't really do anything except give you a little bit of control over the order that you get your cards in. The reason it's powerful, as most listeners will know, is when you combine it with fetch lands, especially because that's just the easiest, most accessible free shuffle effect that any deck that has access to it is going to be running already. It means you can actually get rid of those cards, and better than a scry where you're just sculpting the top of your library, you can actually sculpt your entire hand from the top of your library.
Right.
It also just does this really, really unique thing that is amazing that just lets you control the top of your library with a really flexible amount of precision because you have access to, imagine you starting with 7 cards, you have the 6 cards left after the Brainstorm, and then 3 more. You've got 9 cards you can choose from. So if you have any other effects that interact at the top of the library, I mean, this is not where the real power comes from, but I think that this is where a lot of interest in some of the high ceiling comes from, where if you have, miracles or other effects that actually interact with the top card of your library, this is a really efficient instant speed way to allow you to do that.
Yeah, and trust me, we'll get to all of the edge cases where Brainstorm is useful and what its high ceilings are, but what you said as a sort of baseline for its power level in Legacy, Vintage as well, it's restricted in Vintage. You can play 1 copy, and most decks do. But Legacy is kind of defined by Brainstorm because so many decks play 4 of Brainstorm, and that allows them to really have unprecedented control over the consistency of their deck. Just draw just as many lands as they need, draw the right answers when they need them, draw threats when they want them, just draw everything kind of in the exact right order when you have your brainstorms to help stack your draws, and those fetch lands or other shuffle effects to shuffle away the cards you don't want right now so that you get fresh, clean draws off the top of your deck. That is the kind of very simple answer for why Brainstorm is really, really, really good. And in general, in formats with fetch lands, better than a Ponder or a Preordain, which are both cards that were printed in Modern. They were printed after Brainstorm. And I was trying to find some evidence of this, but I couldn't anywhere. I suspect that Ponder and Preordain were essentially just like, can we fix Brainstorm? Like, Brainstorm's too good. Can we make a fixed version of Brainstorm that, doesn't break these formats? And turns out both those cards had to be banned in Modern too, and one of them had to be restricted in Vintage as well. So this effect of just cheap card selection is very powerful because it lets players just combat one of the natural forces in Magic, which is just variance, right? Like, both players in a game of Magic are going to have to deal with variance. You're going to draw cards when you don't want them. You're going to mana flood. You're going to mana screw. And what these cards do is just help you combat that sort of core force in Magic. And that's what makes them so powerful in really every kind of format in which they're legal. So the other side of this argument, this, if you have no shuffle effect, you are just basically drawing a card. The detractors of Brainstorm, again, say this is roughly equivalent to 1 blue mana, draw a card, and point to cards like Reach Through Mists or Quicken or Peek or other cantrips that have very sort of narrow or conditional upsides. Another great example is Whispers of the Muse. I think it might be a sorcery, though.
I think Quicken is another one that I really enjoy because if you're looking for those cheap cantrips, it does have a really high upside in very narrow cases.
Yes, it can definitely be very flashy. But all these cards basically, more or less, under most use cases, come down to 1 blue mana, draw a card. And the suggestion by the detractors of Brainstorm, specifically in Cube, are that if you don't have 12 fetch lands in your 60-card deck like you do in Constructed, you're just playing 1 blue mana, draw a card, and that is not good enough, right? Like, these other cards we see, like Reach Through Mist, is not played in very many cubes. Peek, Quicken, not played in that many cubes compared to cards like Ponder or Preordain, that sort of effect is not good enough. And I'm going to dive into a little bit to why I think that's maybe not the case. But first, to take it a step further, some people even contend that, and this argument I do want to touch on just to mention, but I think we'll just kind of broadly rebuke it and then ignore it, basically. Some people think that Brainstorm is even worse than blue mana, draw a card because they believe in this idea of brainstorm blocking yourself, which is basically that I got to draw 3 cards. If I don't have a shuffle effect or some way to reset the top of my library, I have to put 2 cards back, and then that has basically stacked my draws for the next 2 turns. And the perception is that this card didn't give me what I wanted right now and also made my next 2 turns bad for me because I presumably put the worst cards back on top of my deck. I know what's coming. I know I don't have an answer. I know I'm not going to turn the corner, whatever. And the emotional impact of that from a cube design perspective is real. Like, if you just don't want those feel bads, then that's a reason to not play the card. But from a pure card evaluation perspective, that is, strictly speaking, not a thing.
Right. I mean, it's about as sensical as saying, well, if I'm milling cards, I'm losing those cards, right? Or like...
That one even is more justifiable because if you have tutors or something, you might genuinely mill a card that you need in your deck for some reason. Like,
sure, so there are cases where that's somewhat justifiable. But the core idea is just that you are already not going to draw the answer you needed or the land you needed or whatever. Brainstorm has just let you see that. It's made you aware of that, so...
It's even giving you more chances to see it. Like, I like to think of swapping any card other than Brainstorm in that situation when your next 2 draws are already... Your next 3 draws are already not good for you. Put any other card in there. You didn't even get to know those next cards were not any good for you.
Right. So, logical fallacy, we can just move on.
Yeah. So, it is strictly better. Well, strictly better, so hard to say. I guess if you only have 1 card in your deck, it's not strictly better than draw a card because you will die to drawing from an empty library. But it is practically better than blue mana, draw a card, instant speed. But we can kind of compare that as a rough baseline for the fail case of the card. Let's dive into how bad Reach Through Mists is. And this, Anthony, is where we have to, I think, get a little bit in the weeds and talk a little bit about Xerox theory, which is something that I'm not sure we've ever actually talked about at length in the podcast before. Maybe in the future we can do an entire episode dedicated to Xerox theory because it's got a whole sort of a bunch of topics that are all related and connected to it. But for the purposes of this discussion...
I want to be honest, I think it's not a super useful term that gets used and applied in all kinds of silly ways, basically to say, like, cards that draw you cards are good. And it's like, sure, I guess so.
Well, let me maybe try and make the case that it is useful just by explaining it in a very concise way. Because I agree, I've seen people use it in perhaps not useful ways. And that's kind of true of a lot of Magic lingo, is people just tend to throw Baneslayer and Muldrifter around without actually really thinking about what they mean.
Baneslayer... Muldrifter.
Xerox theory is complicated. It's maybe not totally agreed upon exactly what it is. I would argue that it basically boils down to the idea that a high density of efficient one-for-one cantrips is a potent, powerful deck building strategy, which I think is somewhat counterintuitive. I think if you took someone that was a new player at Magic and said, yeah, in your 60 card deck, you should have 8 of these cards and just say, draw a card, basically, that would be kind of weird to think that would be powerful, right? They're like, where are the powerful cards that remove my opponent's stuff, that actually produce card advantage, that threaten my opponent and actually kill them? I want to refer to a conspiracy, actually, to kind of make this argument, and that conspiracy is Advantageous Proclamation. This is the conspiracy that says your minimum deck size is reduced by 5. So in a traditional conspiracy draft or any other 40-card draft, you get to play a 35-card deck instead of a 40-card deck. Anthony, if you open a cube that has conspiracies in it and you have the choice between Black Lotus and Advantageous Proclamation, what are you going to take?
I think the right answer is Advantageous Proclamation by a pretty wide margin. I mean, that's a little bit of a difficult comparison because the other thing that's really, really busted about the conspiracies is that you always have access to it. So It's like, I'm not going to draw my Black Lotus every game, but I will always have this effect. But what it does mean is that whatever else is really powerful in your deck, you're just going to draw it that much higher percentage of the time. Like
right.
Or just think about it, you just exclude the top or bottom 5 or more because you're adjusting your land percentage as well of the worst cards from your deck. So it
your overall card quality just goes up.
Right. Especially when there is a wide power delta. And when you're talking about Black Lotus, we are talking about a wide power delta unless it's a cube of just Black Lotuses.
Yeah, I'm taking Advantageous Proclamation every single time. I think players that maybe haven't played with conspiracies, that might sound weird, but Black Lotus is a good card, but it's a good card when you draw it. And frankly, it's only really a good card when you draw it in like the developing turns of the game. It's kind of an awful top deck if you've already emptied your hand. So Advantageous Proclamation is an effect you get every single game. You don't need to roll the 1 in 3 dice that you will see that card over the course of the game in the case of something like Black Lotus. So in some ways, Lotus needs to be more than 3 times better than Advantageous Proclamation when it resolves and is useful in order to make up for that pick. And I just don't think it is, because starting with a 35-card deck is a huge advantage. Your deck just gets to execute its plan more often, get mana screwed and mana flooded less, find key cards for matchups more frequently because your deck is just smaller. All your card quality goes up. So if you take a given cube draft deck of any cube, your cube, my cube, Magic Online Vintage Cube, and just swap out the 5 worst cards for a card that has generic cycling, 1 mana, right? 1 mana cycling, just discard this card, draw a card. That is essentially like playing Advantageous Proclamation at the cost of 0 to 5 mana, however many of those cards you draw over the course of the game. Does that argument make a little bit of sense? Like, if you're basically saying, take the first 5 cards out, play the best 35, add in these 5 cantrips, these 5 cycling cards, you're getting the same effect. You're playing a 35-card deck that's buried in a 40-card deck at the cost of every time you draw one of those cycling cards, you just have to pay a mana to have the advantage of playing with your 35-card deck.
Yes, I think there are some really complex wrinkles to that, but at its core, I definitely see what you're saying.
And it's important that it's not 5 mana, right? It's however much mana you draw over the course of the game. Like if you imagine your deck without swapping those 5 worst cards out, you might have games where you just don't draw those 5 worst cards. And then, you probably did your land balance a little bit differently because you were building a 40-card deck. But in that case, like, you kind of drew the better half of your deck anyway, right? You didn't have to pay for any of those cards. Sometimes you have to pay for 2 or 3 of them. It's not a fixed cost, which makes it kind of hard to evaluate. But for me, that effect is definitely worth 5 mana in basically any context. Like, I'm happy to do it. So basically, I would argue that, like, Xerox theory, or whatever you want to call it, boils down to the argument that effect, that Advantageous Proclamation style effect, is worth that 0 to 5 mana, 0 to 7 mana, whatever you want to call it, however many cantrips you have. The whole argument of Xerox theory is just that consistency that is imparted by that smaller deck is worth a little bit of mana over the course of all of your games to get the advantage of playing with a more consistent deck.
I think that construction, or that sort of like equation that you've set up, makes perfect sense. The question to me there is what are the actual values? Where how much mana am I going to spend where it's actually worth it?
Right.
But I think if we're just not worrying about actual numbers and just sort of worrying about this logical construction, that does make sense. What I am a little bit skeptical about is if we're actually talking about not building a constructed deck, but a drafted environment like Cube most often is. Am I taking a thing that is make your deck 1 card smaller over a card that is actually going to be above average for my deck? I don't think so.
Let's table that, because we'll come back to that. And I think that question, has to bring in a couple of other elements we're going to talk about next. Right now, I'm just talking about treating these cards as 1 mana cycling. And in that example, no, definitely not. Like, I'm not going to take a 1 mana generic cycler over any card that I think is over 50% of playable in my deck, because to your point, that's just kind of diluting my card quality because I've spent a pick on it. Whereas if I had a pool of cards to build my deck from, without having to draft them, I might decide to put a density of these Xerox effects in there. It's very different when you have to draft them. But let's come back to that in a second. I do want to touch on what you alluded to there, which is the diminishing returns of this effect, because I think a lot of the power of this Xerox theory, for lack of a better term, is that it's very unlikely for any deck in any format of Magic to just perfectly curve out every single game. You are going to have turns where there's mana left over. You didn't have anything to do with your mana. This is especially true if you have a deck that is reactive, that's playing counter spells, removal spells, that isn't trying to be proactive and put pressure on your opponent. You're going to have turns where there's nothing to do because your opponent hasn't presented a threat. There hasn't been anything to counter yet. And I think a lot of the power of the Xerox theory is that, I mentioned that I'm willing to pay up to 5 mana or whatever for that advantageous proclamation effect. But in a lot of games, if I have these 1 mana cyclers in my hand, these imaginary 1 mana cyclers, on a turn where I wasn't going to do anything with that mana anyway, the opportunity cost is actually kind of free, right? Like if I was not going to do anything on turn 1 because I have nothing to do before my opponent plays a threat, then just drawing a card is free. If I held up a counter spell and my opponent didn't cast a spell that turn, then I can cycle on their end step, and that mana wasn't going to be spent in the first place. And so the diminishing returns, I think, come in when the amount of mana you're committing to this effect tips over into actually disrupting your curve and what your deck otherwise wants to be doing, disrupting your plan. It doesn't just kind of fit into this nebulous space of leftover mana. And I don't know where that line is. I think it's very dependent on the actual specific cards in your deck and what your overall strategy is. But suffice it to say, I'm happy to pay 5 mana over the course of my game for advantageous proclamation. I am not happy to pay 20 mana over the course of the game to play a virtual 20 card deck, right? Like that would be detrimental because at that point I'm just only cycling cards away and not doing anything with any of my mana because I have to just cycle through my deck to find anything because my deck is so minimized by this effect. So it's a delicate balance. There isn't a perfect science to it, to my knowledge. If you've worked out the perfect science, listener, then write in and let me know. But that's the theory as I sort of wrap my head around it. And again, that's just treating these cards as 1 mana cyclers with no synergy, no cycling synergy, no graveyard synergy, no anything synergy, no draw card synergy, just a way to thin your deck. But that's what I think Xerox theory kind of lends itself to.
So you're saying at this point that you are not unhappy to put Reach Through the Mists in your cube decks, in your cube specifically, where you have, where you're saying that number, that mana return on investment makes sense and is like net positive to your win percentage is 5 mana.
Yeah, I would be happy to play Reach Through the Mists in a lot of my cube decks. I think it would be fine. There's a lot of packs where I would take Reach Through Mists over other cards in the same color that are otherwise in the pack. There's a lot of reasons I don't include Reach Through Mist in my cube, but it's not because I think it's not powerful enough.
It's because you don't also want to include Peer Through the Depths and Sift Through the Sands.
Exactly, precisely. That's exactly why. In Cube and other Eternal constructed formats, these Xerox strategies have a lot of overlap with other powerful strategies and mechanics, right? It's not just that you're thinning your deck, it's that you are doing other things with these cantrips, right? So most of them are spells, in the case of Ponder, Preordain, and Brainstorm, so they're going to trigger spell cast effects, Prowess, Young Pyromancer, Monastery Mentor, stuff like that. That can amount to a decent bit of value. They almost all put cards in a graveyard, so they're going to fuel Delve spells, Delirium, Tarmogoyfs, that kind of stuff, which is very relevant. And then most importantly, we're actually not playing just straight up draw card effects most of the time. We're playing cards that have other slight card selection. So this, I think, is the kind of foundation to understand why Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain have been so problematic and restricted and banned in so many formats, because that's the baseline for that 1 mana draw card. Very low cost of inclusion. Some decks, I think, are even very happy to play it, regardless of any other effects. And as soon as you staple any kind of substantial card selection onto it, the various scrying, the possibility of shuffling, it becomes really very, very, very potent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a completely different territory. And maybe you see these as more similar, but I feel like the difference between purely cycling, like getting the effect of advantageous proclamation for some amount of mana, is very different from being able to scry to and draw a card and actually get some card selection, because it gives you a different thing. It's not just improving your likelihood of drawing certain things by a small amount by shrinking your effective deck size. It's letting you look through multiple cards and giving you multiple hits at potentially hitting that. So I feel like there is a huge difference there.
I think the bigger difference is like in terms of player autonomy, right? Like I think part of the reason Ponder and Preordain are so beloved amongst cube designers and Magic players at large is because they give you choices. Like you get to like look at the cards and make choices about things. 1 mana draw card is not that exciting. I mean, players love drawing cards, but not that much, right? Like it's just drawing a card. It's kind of boring. But ultimately, like they do have a very, very similar effect, plus all that gravy of the actual selection they provide. So it's true that I think the Xerox theory is not dependent on any of that. I don't think you have to be playing the best of the best, most powerful, most selection cantrips. I don't think you have to be doing Delve stuff or Delirium stuff or have Young Pyromancer in an environment for this deck to make sense. That the Xerox theory is kind of just the thinning part of it. But in reality, in practice, when you end up playing these cards in most Magic formats, it does overlap with all these other strategies and then becomes a very powerful thing because it's combining all this stuff together to make this kind of potent engine. Not only is your deck more consistent, not only is it virtually smaller, but also you have these very potent cards like Young Pyromancer or whatever that once you find it, it turns this thing your deck was already doing and already very happy to do to play its consistent game plan into a win condition. And you're also more likely to find the Young Pyromancer because you have all these cantrips in your deck. So basically, my take is that Reach Through Mist is actually very playable in a lot of contexts and perfectly fine. And the fact that it's not played really comes down to a bunch of other factors. Like there is that diminishing returns on cantrips. And so in constructed formats where you have access to Ops and Considers and Serum Visions and stuff like that, you're not going to get to Reach Through Mist because it's just not the best one. And again, the 12th one is less valuable than the 4th one or the 8th one. So that kind of pushes that in those contexts. And frankly, I just think it's a card that most cube designers are bored by. So cube designers are not going to add it to their cube because it feels like a waste of a slot in their 360 card cube or whatever because it just draws a card, which is not particularly exciting for most players.
And I think that's totally legitimate and
Absolutely.
reasonable. Like the point of cube is for most of us to play with the cards that we love and that we really enjoy casting. And I agree, although I mean, I'm going to be the nerd here and say the idea of getting the full set of the Mist cards does sound very cool to me.
There you go.
But
draft package, baby.
Sure, we could do that. But yeah, I mean, Brainstorm is a lot more fun to cast.
Way more fun. So much
than
fun.
Just drawing a card purely. And similar like these upsides of, something like Thought Scour or just minimal effects like Opt, like that level of choice, I think is a lot more fun. And so I think it's
for sure
a reasonable, even if you're saying this card would actually increase more individual players' win percentage if they drafted it, that might be true, but that doesn't mean adding it to a cube is better because you can't increase the win rate of the whole cube, right?
Right.
Like that's just a nonsensical thing. So
I'm only arguing that it is playable on power level. I'm arguing that it wouldn't have a decreased win percentage compared to an average card in most cube environments. It would be perfectly fine. It would hang with the rest of the cards. It would be totally viable. And that is purely a power level evaluation. I agree for all the reasons you mentioned that I'm not running it in my cube. I never will be because, like you said, all these cards that provide some kind of selection are more fun to cast, more fun to resolve. They give you more choices, and that's what I want my games to be about. But in terms of power level evaluations, I don't think Reach Through Mist is actually that far. The only evidence I can point to that is to kind of make this case is I did a little looking at some various constructed metas, and currently the Penny Dreadful meta is purely red-blue tempo decks, basically. My understanding of Penny Dreadful, this is a format where it's on Magic Online only, and you're allowed to play only cards that cost a penny, which is like kind of the floor for cards in on Magic Online's price system. And my understanding is that this format has no other management, so there's no ban list, right? If it's under a penny, you get to play it no matter what it is. And sometimes there are really broken decks in the meta. They basically update it every 6 months or something and say, here's the new cards that are in Penny Dreadful for the next cycle. And right now, this format is dominated by Ponder, Gitaxian Probe, Treasure Cruise, all kinds of really, really powerful staples. But Peak and Quicken both see tons of play in Penny Dreadful decks because they are basically just blue mana draw card. So these are powerful decks. They're playing powerful cards, but because of the price restriction, a lot of the more interesting, more fun, more dynamic, more powerful cantrips are ruled out, but these decks have found that Peak and Quicken are actually totally fine. They can totally do the job.
Is the format popular enough that there's actually a feedback loop there that people playing the format will drive cards out of it?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to it, so I'm not going to make it up.
I respect that.
That's my sort of argument for the Reach Through Mist's fail case of Brainstorm. And maybe it's convinced some of you that, yes, that consistency, that deck thinning is actually very valuable, and every little cantrip you pick up is like 1/5 or 1/4 of an Advantageous Proclamation, and it's worth paying that extra mana you weren't going to use anyway to basically have that effect as you play through your games. But in case I haven't convinced you, I want to talk about all the ways in which the fail case of Brainstorm is actually way better than Reach Through Mist, because it is not just blue mana draw card, not even close.
Okay, so we started with Brainstorm is really highly evaluated because it's iconic and defines all these other formats. To people are over-evaluating, so they're correcting and saying Brainstorm is actually not that good in Cube. And then you're saying, well, the baseline is actually pretty high, so you're coming towards the middle. And now we're going to go way back up to the top again because we're going to look at what Brainstorm actually does.
We're going all over the place. I wanted to show the range of opinions of Brainstorm. And I mean, to be clear, my opinion is that it's very powerful and I love it. and I think it deserves a high pick in almost any environment and scales very well with most environments in which it's played. So my agenda, for what it's worth, is that the card is very good, and I actually think broadly underrated by the Cube community. Now, Justin and Ryan, I think, kind of run in a different Cube community in some ways than I think you and I do, because, you know, they're not, to my knowledge, part of any of the Discord communities or like having Reddit conversations on Reddit, but they are sort of more broadly publicly visible, and I think spend a lot of time interacting with a broader base of people that are just playing the Magic Online Cube. And their perception is that the card is overrated because people are taking it highly and they shouldn't. And my perception is that it's underrated because I'm constantly seeing Cube designers talk about how you should cut Brainstorm from this list because you have only 3 shuffle effects, or you're going to get Brainstorm locked, or I don't have that card because it's much worse than Opt or Consider. And so there's a wide range of perceptions. I wanted to just kind of make sure we lay out the landscape so people understand where people are coming from with this card.
It's interesting also, there are like a couple different data points you're talking about. One is, are people actually putting it in cubes? And yes, a ton of people are putting it in cubes. It's almost half of vintage cubes on Cube Cobra. Then there's the sort of perspective of the very vocal minority, the public figures in the Cube community. And then there's also the play rate. So it's both how do Cube designers want to put it in their cube, and then how do players want to play it, and then how do people talk about it.
Yeah, and I see people on the Discords or like on the limited resources subreddit when the Vintage Cube is live. I see people telling people to cut Brainstorm from their list because they don't have enough shuffle effects. So like, I see it pop up from time to time. Anyway, let's talk about all the ways in which the fail case, even assuming you have no way to reset the top of your library, why Brainstorm is so much better than just one blue mana draw card. And the first one is that it draws you 3 cards, not 1 card. And obviously it nets you 1 card, but the fact that it digs you 3 deep is a huge advantage. Like, it's just huge to know that your card you need could be 3 cards down to your library and you still get to draw it this turn. That's much better than just draw a card.
If you need to hit your 3rd land on turn 3, you can actually do it. And maybe your 4th land doesn't matter that much, so that tempo advantage actually lets you sequence things in a meaningful way. Or you need the removal spell now, and if you didn't have it 2 turns, if you did draw it 2 turns from now, it wouldn't have the same effect. So that level of control is very meaningful.
Yeah. And again, even without a shuffle, drawing 3 in 1 turn is valuable because, you know, I've had games where I've drawn my splash card and my splash source off my Brainstorm and been like, great, back on top of the library go the cards in my hand because these 2 cards are much better and I'm going to play them both this turn right now. And that's a thing that no other cantrip that we're talking about today will let you do. No Ponder, no Preordain, none of these other cantrips will ever let you do that. Only Brainstorm lets you actually play 2 or 3 cards off the top of your library the same turn that you cast that spell.
So true.
It does trigger draw effects 3 times, which I have to note. I mean, if you have something that triggers when you draw a card, it's going to do it 3 times, which is a bit of an advantage. You could also argue that's a disadvantage on power level if there are things that punish card drawing, or say players can't draw more than 1 card at a turn or something like that. And those things do exist, so it kind of cuts both ways.
I think that's a big one, honestly. I think that a lot of high-powered cube designers, they try and avoid these kinds of it's sort of like effects that feel like keywords that just say, whenever you draw a card, do a thing. But I think there are a lot of these cards.
Do they avoid cards like that? There's a lot of whenever you cast a spell, do a thing in powerful cubes.
That is for sure true. But I think we're seeing more and more of just these like cheap, reasonable effects that trigger on drawing cards. So I think that is a really meaningful interaction. I know I enjoy it very much in my wizard deck with Ironcrag Pyromancer, being able to trigger that on my opponent's turn. Having removal in Commander is a lot of fun, I should note.
You got to have it incidentally. You can't dedicate whole cards to it, but there it works really well. Brainstorm also allows you to retuck cards you don't want into your library. So mostly targets for things like Tinker, Natural Order, Oath of Druids, your Grizzlebrand to Entomb It, because that's easier than actually having a discard outlet. There are cards you sometimes want in your library that just end up in your hand. If it's already in your hand, casting a Ponder or Preordain is not going to help you. It's still going to be stuck in your hand. So Brainstorm does let you do that.
And I think this is a case where really, like you're saying, the uniqueness is worth emphasizing. Nothing else really lets you do that at all.
It's really hard to think of any other. I mean, like Scroll Rack, I guess, lets you do it at
Fire
steep
Prophecy?
cost.
Do you want to get really weird?
Yeah, Fire Prophecy does kind of let you do it. That's true. But yeah, that's a very unique effect of Brainstorm, and a quite powerful one in the right context. I mean, when Brainstorm does that for you for 1 mana at instant speed, that is huge.
And I don't know if this is maybe a separate point you have or a subpoint of this, but it also lets you protect from cards that you don't want to discard. So
that
your
is
opponent
literally
casts,
the next effect. The next thing on my list. No, you go. I was just saying great minds.
If your opponent casts Hymn to Torok or something that's going to force you to discard something, or a Thoughtseize that's going to be a targeted discard, and you have something you need to protect, it's a way that very sneakily you can put things back on top of your library, which is a very satisfying play pattern.
And there's almost nothing that does that in all of Magic except for like Gush the Scepter. Gush the Scepter does let you do that. Look it up, everybody. It'll be on luckypaper.co/podcast/75/cards. You'll see it there. It'll be great. It also lets you stack on top of your deck for any cards that care about the top of your deck. You mentioned that. Your Oracles of Moldiah, your Coursers of Krufix, your Counterbalances, whatever you have that cares about the top of your deck. Bolas of Citadel. It's a great thing. All of these things may sound like small edge cases, and in some ways they are, but my experience playing with Brainstorm in a variety of environments is that it comes up way more often than you think. And as soon as you get one or two little edge cases like this on a card that, again, I think has an incredible floor. Like, all cards have fail cases. Removal, sometimes your opponent has no threats. Your expensive cards you can't cast early. You draw your cheap creature on turn 7, and it's not that impactful anymore. All cards have fail cases. Your 15th land is worth nothing to you. But Brainstorm's fail case is among the least bad of all cards I think ever printed. Like, it just draws you another card, and the best card of the top 3 in your deck. This like idea that if you can't shuffle, the fail case is somehow bad is, I think, really off. Given all those things, Anthony, I have gone through and done the tedious math for the Bun Magic Cube, the regular cube, and the MTGO Vintage Cube to count every single card in the cube that does something that Brainstorm cares about, that has some synergy with Brainstorm or against Brainstorm in the sense of like protecting against hand tape. Like, I counted cards like Duress here.
All right, so I'm looking at my list. Are you counting like Goblin Wizardry for prowess reasons? Are you counting
I did count Goblin Wizardry for
Mad Ratter because
Yes.
you're drawing cards? Okay, great.
I counted all these
good
cards.
things.
Counted everything. Now, I likely missed some cards. I'm not going to pretend these are exact numbers, but I really doubt I counted something that shouldn't be counted. So these are like minimum numbers. I want to start with the Magic Online Vintage Cube. 540 card cube. How many cards or percentage, whatever you want to give, do you think are better with Brainstorm?
I'm going to guess 30%.
It's 20%, 19%, 103 individual cards that are better with Brainstorm. That spells matter stuff that shuffles, stuff that matters in your yard, top deck matters stuff, hand hate, library matter stuff. This is the only cube. Neither your cube or mine have any library matter stuff. We don't care about tucking things away for Tinker or Natural Order, but there are 5 cards in the Magic Online Vintage Cube where you would care about that. That's a lot of cards. It's 1/5 of the entire cube are cards that have some edge, small or large, with specifically Brainstorm in your deck. Regular cube, Anthony, what's your guess?
I feel like if I'm adjusting, if there's too many complicated factors that are going to influence me, I feel like I should guess 20% again. Let's go 25%. Let's hedge a little.
22%,
Okay.
slightly more than the Magic Online Vintage Cube. There are 89 cards by my count in your 410 card. How many cards are in your cube right now?
Currently 410 today. It's probably going to change tomorrow.
In your 410 card cube that care about Brainstorm. You really love top deck matter stuff.
I do.
And I mean, it sounds silly, right? Like things like I counted the Scrylands because there are plenty of times where
absolutely.
in the late game you Brainstorm, put a card you don't want right on top of your deck, and then you Scryland and scry it away. And that may sound like a very tiny edge, but that's very powerful. Like, changing Brainstorm from like draw a card to draw 3 cards, take 1 card from your hand and exile it, just get rid of it completely, put 1 card back on top of your library. It's a much more powerful card. And if you get to do that, that just makes your deck that much better. Yeah, you really went pretty deep on the top deck matter stuff.
I mean, we're talking 2%.
No, it's 10%. You have 43 top deck matters cards in your cube by my count.
2% difference from the Magic Online Cube.
Oh, but that's specifically just top deck matters. 2% difference in overall cards that care about Brainstorm, but the whole Magic Online Cube, which is bigger than yours, only has 23 cards that care about the top deck.
I see.
Yours has 43. You also crushed me in top deck matters. You just really like the top of the deck. That's fine. That's
Top of the deck is a fun. It's a
thing about
of all the zones.
You've got Future Sight, you've got Bolas of Citadel, you've got them all. Finally, Bun Magic Cube. My cube is 360 cards. What's your guess for percentage? Again, 19% for the Magic Online Vintage Cube, 22% for the regular cube. What do you think the Bun Magic Cube is?
I feel like we're either just going to go way high or based on all this discussion we just had,
metagaming, just say a number.
I'm going to guess 19%.
27%. So a little higher. So, but again, we're looking
That's
at like...
a lot. Well, that's much closer to my first guess. This
we're
is
looking
a
at
frustrating
between,
game.
like, for all these cubes, between 1/5 and 1/4 of the cards are going to be better with Brainstorm, or you're going to be better for having Brainstorm playing against them, right? That's just a lot of the cube, right? Like... Hi, it's Andy, host of Lucky Paper Radio, the podcast you're listening to right now. While I was editing this show, I wish I had gone a little deeper on this point. As often happens while I'm editing, I regret not saying something. Then I figured, you know what? I produce this show. I can do whatever I want. So here I am injecting a little more context for exactly how deep these numbers go. But what I've done here is taken those percentages of cards that care about Brainstorm in those cubes, looked at on average how many cards you're going to have in a normal draft pool, and then run some hypergeometric calculations to figure out how likely you are to have seen one of these cards that cares about Brainstorm by turn 4 or 5, which I think is a pretty safe bet that in most environments the game is going to last at least until turn 4 or 5. For these numbers, I'm assuming that 2/3 of the Brainstorm Matters cards in your average pool are going to end up main decked. That's based on some numbers we've crunched from Cube Cobra. It actually varies quite a bit from cube to cube, the percentage of your draft pool that ends up main decked. The primary factor is how many non-basic lands you have in your cube, right? Because the more non-basic lands you have, the more slots you have in your deck for cards you drafted, and your smaller your sideboard is. But in general, 2/3 of the cards you end up drafting more or less end up in your deck in most cube environments. So for the Magic Online cube, this comes out to around 5 cards in each pool on average main decked. And that means that in a game where you draw Brainstorm and the game lasts a turn 4 or 5, you're 79% to have seen at least one of those 5 cards, and hopefully combined with Brainstorm for that additional power. In the regular cube, you're likely to have around 7 cards main decked, which is a 90% chance of seeing at least one. And in the Bun Magic cube, there's roughly 8 cards main deck, which means you are 93% to see at least one of those cards over the course of an average first 4 or 5 turns of a game. These are really rough averages. Obviously, this doesn't take into account the fact that you might be prioritizing these kinds of effects in the draft, in which case you would have even more of them. And there's a lot of complexity I didn't account for. So, for example, with the hand hate cards like Duress and Thoughtseize, it doesn't matter if you have them, right? It matters if your opponent has them and you have Brainstorm, but that's like a layer too deep. I'm not going that far. I'm not trying to get a PhD in math here. I'm just giving some rough approximations. I mean, who do you think I am? Jet? Still, I think this is kind of striking. You know, basically, if you don't attempt to draft around Brainstorm at all, you just have cards from the cube on average. Over most games, you are 79, 90, and 93% likely to have a card that combines with Brainstorm in some powerful way. Pretty good card, I think. I feel like the argument that Brainstorm is no good without fetch lands, like without the ability to shuffle, is an argument that we got to test when Historic was invented and they decided to print Brainstorm into Historic. The Brainstorm was printed back in Mercadian Masks in like 1998 or whatever, whenever that was. And never got reprinted into Modern because it proved to be kind of problematic when, especially when Fetchlands came around with Onslaught in 2000, I'm guessing. I'm kind of roughing these numbers. Which one? I get Historic and Pioneer confused. One of them is basically the constructed format that is all of the cards on Magic Arena, with exceptions for bans and suspensions.
Right, so it was everything that had been printed plus a bunch of specific cards they've added to Arena just to expand the Historic metagame.
Right, that's what Historic is. So yeah, Historic is basically just a constructed format that is Arena constructed, Arena Eternal for more or less. And
Arena Type 1.
Sure. And as Anthony intimated, even though Brainstorm was printed forever ago and has never been printed in a modern legal set because of power level considerations, it was added, was it Mystical Archive? Whatever they did.
Yeah, so I mean, they even just printed some like packages where they're just like, these cards are available now, just totally separate from anything. That came in the Strixhaven Mystical Archives, which is that special bonus sheet of cards that would pop up every once in a while.
Either way, they printed Brainstorm into Historic, and the argument for why it might be okay was that there are no fetch lands in Historic save for Fable Passage. There's none of the 10 fetch lands, capital F fetch lands are in Historic. So that kind of approximates a pre-fetchland printing Brainstorm back in the day. And guess what? I mean, Brainstorm proved to be much too good in Historic. It dominated the meta, got suspended, and eventually got banned because it's a Magic card that just has synergy with other Magic cards. As I covered, like between 1/5 and 1/4 of those 3 cubes I looked at, which are 3 very different cubes. And the same is true for the Historic metagame. There's just enough ways to shuffle your library or to get some other kind of value off of Brainstorm that you don't need fetchlands for it to be good. And that's overall kind of, in summary, my evaluation of the card. It's just there's enough ways to get value off of it that you don't need to be doing this like prescriptive thing that has made it really, really good in Legacy, where you have fetch lands specifically. Like, I played it in your cube just in combination with like Master of Death and been thrilled because it's great. We've talked before about how card evaluation comes down to how good is the best case scenario of the card, how bad is the worst case scenario, and what does that like distribution curve look like in between, right? Like, how often are these things going to occur? And my argument with Brainstorm is that how good is it when it's good? It's extremely good. It is singularly good. When you get to tuck a card that was going to be hit with hand hate, when you get to draw 3 and then crack a fetch and shuffle 2 cards away, there are no cards in Magic's history that do that. It stands alone as an incredibly powerful card when it's really good. How bad is it when it's bad? To refer back to the whole reach through mists conversation, I don't think it's that bad. I think the floor of this card is really, really strong, and feel bads aside, the feel bads of knowing you're going to lose this game in the next 2 turns because you don't have the answer and you're not going to find it, it's just a very, very strong floor. It's
arguably an incredibly high floor because you can just skip those 2 turns and get on to the next game.
You just get to concede. That's great. And then as far as the ratios in which the outcomes occur, I think most people think that it's primarily a reach through miss that is sometimes better, and I would argue that it's actually most of the time much better. I do want to touch on a fact here, which is that I think his card is difficult to play with because even though I mentioned that cantrips are very good oftentimes in this sort of Xerox theory construct at filling in leftover mana in your curve, like just I had nothing to do with my mana, so I just cast my cantrip. That's actually not the way to optimize Brainstorm play. You certainly can do it because it does draw a card effectively. Like if you think you have to, you can just turn one Brainstorm. But it's really not capitalizing on what makes the card good. And I think there's a lot of players, a lot has been written, many articles, many podcasts, many discussions have been had about how to play with Brainstorm. And so I won't try and like offer my suggestion here other than to say that I think waiting till later in the game is good. Waiting till you get to get this extra value off of it if you can afford to is usually worth it. And I think players that don't know how to play with Brainstorm might have this perception from casting it on turn 1 all the time or just casting it when they have open mana and, no way to get any value off of it instead of just drawing a card and no cards in their hand they want to get rid of or whatever, might have this sort of ingrained perception that it's not good just because they maybe aren't experienced at playing with it. I think this is a card that has been uniquely and consistently underrated over the whole course of Magic history, right? So we talked about how it was printed into Historic. They thought it'd be fine. It was actually not fine. It had to get banned. It's restricted in Vintage, so down to 1 copy of Vintage, which is that's like the biggest like red badge on a card in terms of how broken it is when it gets restricted in Vintage. You can only play 1 copy there. It's kind of a problem. When a cantrip like this is too good, I don't think it is readily apparent. Like, I think what you need to understand that a card like Brainstorm is a problem in a certain context, be that a cube or a constructed metagame, is you need a lot of data. You need a bunch of competitive players grinding decks against each other over the course of a long time and playing lots of different matchups and getting that sort of long tail of all these different use cases and win percentages and all that kind of stuff to see actually, okay, after a bunch of games have played out, this is dominating the metagame. It is proven to be an auto-include in any blue deck, and it's made blue decks the most powerful decks in the format, and that's when it has to get banned. It's not like...
We're also not jamming all possible decks into the time-traveling supercomputer. It's a lot of players making decisions based on what they see other players succeeding with. So there's a lot of feedback loops, and we don't necessarily discover the perfect solutions quickly.
But in terms of what like Wizards R&D does or what cube designers do, it's not a card like Oko or like, a Black Lotus where like as soon as you play it, you're like, that was incredible. Like I just took over the game. You can't beat this card. Its impact is much more subtle and nuanced on an individual basis. And in the long term, I think you can see very clearly that it's a very powerful card. But I think that also contributes to the frequent underrating of this card because each time you cast it, it probably, aside from those amazing instances where it saves your key spell from a Thoughtseize or whatever, it probably just felt like draw a card. And you're like, well, that could have been anything else. Why didn't I just have another counterspell in my deck or whatever? And the answer is you had a Brainstorm, which was kind of another counterspell and another land and another removal spell and another threat. It was whatever you needed to be at that one specific time. On the episode of the 540, where Ryan and Justin suggested this is the most overrated card in the Magic Online Vintage Cube. And I want to be clear, I don't want to misrepresent their argument. They did not say this card was bad. They just said it was overrated and that players took it in the first couple picks, and they thought it was more of a mid-pack kind of card, which totally fair. I mean, I don't think they think the card is awful. But in that sort of discussion, Justin suggested that he was playing back when Mercadian Masks was actually printed. You and I were not, or maybe I was actually, but I was 9 or whatever, and I'd forgotten anything had happened, and I stopped playing in the intervening years. Justin was actually playing back then, maybe has some memory of it, and he suggested that nobody played Brainstorm before fetches were printed in Onslaught in those, in between years, and that when Opt was printed in Invasion, which was in between Brainstorm's printing in Mercadian Masks and Fetchland's printing in Onslaught, that everyone was like, oh, Opt is way better than Brainstorm. Now, I trust Justin. I was not there at the time. I tried to dig through some old archives and stuff, and who knows, you can't really find any definitive...
There's not news about the general vibe about cards.
You can find individual articles probably making both cases from back then where somebody was saying Opt was better, someone was saying Brainstorm was better. What was the actual overall pervading evaluation? I don't know. So I trust Justin's evaluation there. But objectively, Brainstorm was played at the highest competitive levels pre any kind of fetch lands and pre-Opt being printed. So looking back at the Mercadian Masks block standard Pro Tour, so this was just Mercadian Masks block cards, which happened in 2000. There were 2 blue decks in the top 8. They both ran 4 copies of Brainstorm. This particular meta was kind of dominated by this red-green Fires deck, and there's also this white Rebels deck. One of the Rebels decks played white-blue, so it could play the Brainstorms, though. But anyway, any blue deck was running Brainstorms in the sort of top 8 of that particular Pro Tour. And importantly, I want to take this opportunity to once again mention my favorite Magic match ever recorded, which I talked about, I'm sure, in the show before, but we've gotten more listeners and subscribers now. So if you haven't ever watched this match, the Pro Tour Chicago 1999 final with Bob Maher and Brian something, where Bob Maher is playing this Bant Oath of Druids deck, and his opponent, Brian something, is playing this Necropotence combo deck, mono black Necropotence combo deck. Such a great match for a lot of reasons, but basically, like, Necropotence was a huge problem combo card. This like deck ended up being extremely dominant and just eventually got banned from this particular format. And so it was kind of like the boogeyman, the big bad guy. And it's the kind of deck that's playing like turn 1, Dark Ritual, Necropotence, draw 8 cards. You know, Bob Maher is playing this Bant deck, which it's called an Oath of Druids deck. And if you're playing Vintage Cube, you might think, oh, Oath of Druids. I put Oath of Druids in play and then I get an Emrakul to pop out later on or something. No. In this Oath of Druids deck, the 3 targets for Oath of Druids are Morphling, which is objectively the most powerful target, I think, which that's the 5 mana 3/3 from Urza's Saga. Shard Phoenix, which is a 3/3 flyer that does a pyroclasm when it dies, and Spike Feeder, which is the dinky little spike card that gains a little bit of life. Like, those were the Oath targets in this deck. It was basically this weird kind of Bant control deck that, if you watch the matches, basically like disassembles Brian's combo deck very skillfully and then kills him with Treetop Villages. Is basically how this deck ends up playing out. And that deck, I think, has some of the best examples of the earliest Brainstorm play. This was only a year after Brainstorm came out. This was the highest levels of competitive play. Brainstorm was a 4 of in the deck that won that Pro Tour. And the Brainstorms are there, presumably, largely to tuck cards for Oath of Druids, those 3 cards. But they also, of course, just provide incredible card selection, incredible consistency. And his opponent does have 4 Duress in his deck, and so he's using it to save cards from Duress throughout the entire match. And it's a great example to me of just the range that this card possibly has. And this is an environment, again, without any fetch lands. Fetch lands have not been seen by the public yet. This idea of Brainstorm only being powerful because you draw 3 cards, shuffle the 2 you don't want away. There's not even a concept yet. This is just playing Brainstorm for all of these quote-unquote edge cases. That is actually the main play case of Brainstorm, in my opinion.
It's me again. I'm back. So I rewatched this match again for the first time in 3 or 4 years. And as you may have heard in the intro, I didn't remember everything exactly correctly. I think I got the spirit of everything more or less correct, but just, for the record, fetch lands did exist before Brainstorm was printed, but they were the slow fetch lands printed originally in Mirage. These were cards like Floodplain. They could be tapped and sacrificed to find one of 2 basic land types and put it into play, but they entered the battlefield tapped, so they were considerably less powerful. Bob Maher's deck did have 3 Floodplains in it, so there were, in fact, some opportunities to shuffle with Brainstorm, but nowhere near the density that we're used to in this argument about Brainstorm being only good with fetch lands. As you can hear, though, the concept, of course, did exist. Not only does he shuffle with Floodplain, but he also shuffles with Gaia's Blessing. And let me tell you, using Gaia's Blessing to shuffle an Impulse, an Enlightened Tutor, and another Gaia's Blessing into your library just so you can reset it and get a shuffle for Brainstorm, peak magic. Really, really recommend watching this match.
Yeah, it's a cool match to watch. So in the end, though, I think you're a little high on Brainstorm.
Talk me down.
I agree with your sort of argument structurally again, but I just don't know if I agree with the numbers. When you say I want to spend 5 mana over the course of a game to have this effect, I'm not convinced in a lot of contexts that's worth it. But I think what's really important to keep in mind is sort of that logical argument and that structure, because the context is absolutely going to change that. There are going to be plenty of environments where that is going to be the case. I also think that there are plenty where that isn't the case, where decks are just very proactive and whoever uses the most mana the quickest is just going to win the game, and you just can't necessarily afford to do that. I also think in a cube like my regular cube, there isn't that much of a delta between the most powerful and least powerful cards, and again, it's like mostly focused around proactive creature decks that play to the board. I don't want that many like cantrip effects that are just going to take up
I do.
time.
I'll take them all.
And I don't think we have the data to back up which decision is right.
Definitely
I definitely do not take Brainstorm or the other cantrips all that highly. That being said, I do really love this card. I think that it's one of the few cards that we share between our cubes, and I think that really speaks to the fact that it scales really well with the environment, and the fact that its main role might be in some context to just be played with fetch lands for this incredible card selection, or in my cube, I think it's much more about, do I want to play this with some of those top deck manipulation cards? and some like scrying and other sort of low powered effects. I think that it scales really well. And I think at the end of the day, again, what we want to do with our cubes is play the cards that are fun. I think Brainstorm is fun.
Very
and
fun.
If you agree, you should probably put it in your cube and you should probably play it because it's fun.
Yeah. To go back to your telling me I'm too high on Brainstorm. Just to make sure I've effectively communicated.
Uh-huh.
It being like 1/5 of an advantageous proclamation is like one small component of what makes it good.
Right.
In my environment specifically, there is, as indicated by the numbers, 27% of the cards. There's a lot of Delve. There's a lot of Delirium. There's a lot of Spells Matter stuff that's going on. So there's a lot of reasons why Brainstorm contributes to other strategies that are not just 1/5 of an advantageous proclamation. But it means that when I look at a pack and I see a Ponder, a Preordain, a Brainstorm, whatever, I'm not looking at that and thinking, oh, it's a 1-mana draw card. I'm thinking, okay, that's going to be 1/5 of my advantageous proclamation. It's going to make my Tarmogoyf 1 power and toughness bigger. It's going to make my Tosigur 1 mana cheaper. It's going to make my Grimlothomancer able to deal 2 damage to a target 1 turn earlier. It's going to do all of these things that are little tiny slices of the pie of what makes that card good, but that's the kind of matrix you have to look at these cards through, I think. And it's different in each environment, to your point, right? Like my environment goes really heavy on that, and so I think Brainstorm is a little relatively better in my environment than it is in yours, just because I have more ways to abuse it, and the environment is more about that. But also, my environment is more mana efficient, lower curving, and faster than your environment. And I think Brainstorm is actually a little bit relatively better there, even though it's a 1 mana do-nothing card. So I don't think that the speed of the environment is necessarily an indicator of whether you do or don't want cantrips. I mean, again, Legacy and Vintage, incredibly fast. Both environments chock full of 1 mana cantrips, because that speed often means you need your deck to be consistent, not stumble on a land, not have an answer when you need an answer, and actually playing these cards that seemingly slow things down make you overall more able to actually play to whatever the board needs at that time by increasing the consistency of your deck. All by means of saying that, yeah, the advantageous proclamation part is one part of it. That's just the Xerox theory.
Right.
Thinning your deck is valuable in a vacuum. When you add in all the other stuff, the fact that I've got Young Pyromancer, the fact that I've got Treasure Cruise, all these other ways to use the card and get other benefits off of it, I think it amounts to a very powerful card that is worthy of an early pick in all three of these environments. I'll do it in the regular cube, I'll do it in the Button Magic cube. I do want to sort of couch this in the sort of context that I have never played the Magic Online Vintage Cube. I've never played Magic Online. I've watched a lot of people play it. I would trust somebody else that's more experienced than I, including Justin and Ryan, as to how high of a pick Brainstorm should be in the Magic Online Vintage Cube. The only caveat I'll give is I thought it was interesting in the episode where they talk about this card being overrated. Justin specifically says he's frustrated about that because players take it too early, and he would love to get it and play it late. He's like, I would love to get this card mid-pack and already have a deck that can take advantage of it and then pick it. People are picking it early and they're not letting me do that. To which I say, I too would like to get good cards mid-pack. Justin, that would be great. But they're taking it early because it's a good card. And the fact that you want it for your deck actively, I think, is evidence that it is a good card in that environment. And maybe you're just a little lower than most people are on it, but I don't think it's because they're necessarily overrating it.
That's a really interesting aspect of draft, how you don't necessarily need to take things at their like correct point in the pack where that is like the matching power level.
Right.
It's all about how other people evaluate cards, and being able to take advantage of those discrepancies is a huge part of the skill of drafting, which to me, that's like part of the fun. Like, obviously this is not what he's saying, but if we take that to the extreme absurd degree, saying everyone should have perfect card evaluation skills and be taking things at the right point in the pack, that kind of takes away a lot of the fun and like opportunity for interesting draft experiences.
Yeah, I wouldn't want everyone to be a clone of me around the draft table, though.
Well, if everyone was a clone of me, they would definitely not have great card evaluation skills.
At least it'd be consistent, though, is the point.
True.
Because your whole point is that as long as the table's on the same page, then
right.
Things will kind of... And there actually are cube designers that do draft their own cubes where they draft every single seat in various ways, either physically or in some digital method, just to kind of see how things turn out when they take their card evaluation skills, apply them to a bunch of individual packs, and see how those cards end up landing. I've never done it to my own cube, but it could be fun.
It could be.
It sounds like a lot of work.
Sounds exhausting.
Yeah, sounds like a lot. Anyway, in summary, I think that the downsides of Brainstorm are largely emotional and not actually power level related. And players overstate them because it feels bad to be Brainstorm locked, when in actuality, that is only a feeling. It is all but a feeling, and feelings will pass.
However, feelings do matter. So maybe if we talk about Brainstorm has a very low or a very high floor in terms of what the actual game mechanics are doing. If it has a very low floor in terms of emotional experience, that I think is also a legitimate reason to exclude the card.
Yeah, I mean, for my part, I don't think it does. I mean, we all include it because I think it's really fun to draw 3 cards and put 2 on top of your deck.
Mm-hmm.
And even if that means, the next 2 draws because it's the fail case or whatever, I think that's still more fun than a lot of other cards, like, a 6-mana card you can't cast or whatever. I do think that deck thinning / Xerox theory / the consistency that is imparted by just pure card draw is something that a lot of players don't have a good grasp on, but is valuable. I am willing to pay for an advantageous proclamation, and how much I'm willing to pay is the thing I think we should be discussing, not whether or not that thing is valuable. And that is part of what goes into that fail case evaluation of Brainstorm, the reach through miss evaluation, is how bad is it to just play 1 mana to draw a card. And my argument is not that bad at all, especially when you have anything else that cares about any of those other things. And as we established by looking at the numbers, Brainstorm combos with Magic cards. All cubes are going to have cards that are going to benefit somehow from what Brainstorm does because of how many zones it touches and how flexible it is. So it's really hard, I think, to create an environment where it actually is close to that reach through mists theoretical fail case. Card's good.
It's a good Magic card.
It is one of the Magic cards, Anthony, that you mentioned something like this on the Discord recently, and I felt it. I agreed with you in my heart, which was that card prices have spiked so much in the past couple years that I feel like whatever I don't have of the chase old reserve list foils or chase weird rare promos, I'm just never going to have now because prices have gone out of my range. The original foil Mercadian Mask Brainstorm might be one of those cards that just stays out of my grasp for a while or ever.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that if the bubble keeps bubbling,
I do think there will come a day where Wizards will print cards that were originally Old Border again in Old Border foil. I think we will see new printings of Old Border foil Brainstorms at some point.
I could see it. I mean, given if the game keeps going, they're going to keep trying new things.
They're going to do everything
and
eventually.
They're going to do everything eventually, so why not?
Yeah.
Except reprint the reserve list.
Do you think we've done a good job? Have we done Brainstorm justice, you think?
Absolutely not. I think that you could do a whole podcast, not just an episode, but a series.
A whole series.
About
Should we write a book about Brainstorm in the way that one guy wrote a book about Gush?
No.
Have you read the Gush book?
I haven't read the Gush book. I think you have to PayPal somebody.
I did buy the PDF. It's not PayPal. I think you just buy it from their website.
Okay.
I have the Gush book. I can load it out to you. Is that frowned upon?
I should probably give some money to
loading
the Gush
books
guy.
out to people is not frowned upon. If you have a physical book, is it the same for a PDF? I mean, it'd be uncouth for me to post it online, but if I had the physical book, I'd give it to you.
How do computers work and ethics? I don't know.
Okay, so only when I got to the end of editing this whole episode did I realize that I think on 2 or 3 occasions we alluded to the fact that Brainstorm was printed in Mercadian masks. And it was, but that wasn't the original printing. It was actually printed in Ice Age in 1995. And look, it's really hard to speak into a microphone for an hour and not say anything wrong. So give us a break, okay? It was originally printed in Ice Age. I'm sorry.
That's it for Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning into this special Brainstorm Extravaganza edition of the show. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Thanks for talking about Magic with me, Anthony.
Absolutely. Looking forward to next week where we talk an entire episode all about Newscraft Mob.
I thought you were going to say Puppet Conjurer or something. But we could talk. I would be totally down.
I was spending a lot of time here trying to decide what card I should name.
I would be totally down to commit a whole other episode to a single card that you think is worthy of 60 minutes of discussion.
I don't think that.
I do really like Newscraft Mob.
It's a fun card.
It's a
as
really,
far as 6 mana
really fun
go.
card. I almost wish it wasn't 6 mana because that makes it harder for you to have the fun because it's 6 mana away.
Yes.
What if Newscraft Mob was like a 3 mana 3/3 same text?
That would be a powerful Magic card.
I'd be into it.
In some contexts. I'm just looking forward to Song in Half my Newscraft Mob. That's going to be great.
We're going to talk a lot about Saw in Half on this podcast, I think. But now is not the time.